You'll catch up.
It's like I'll catch up. I'll wake up sometime.
Yeah, nice situation. Issues, but he's a government. So it's very.
No cameras today. No. The camera is broken. Here. Let's put the camera to the weather. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. Want to get through a lot of stuff today. So are we live on the WebEx? Okay. Well, first, thanks to everyone for making it out. We missed the rain, which is a good thing this morning. So thanks for coming up, and thanks for those who are joining us online. We're really excited about our topic today. It's always a hot topic, and so we'll be taking a look at the functional expenses and some indirect rate. And we find when we do these, it becomes a lively discussion. So please feel free at any time to ask your questions, and certainly if we don't go through all of the questions, we're always available. Just a couple of housekeeping items. So this slide is particularly for those that are joining us online. If you're having any issues, you can reach out to the number or use the chat function, and we'll try to help you. CPE, we are issuing CPE for this. So we'll be saying 3 words throughout the presentation. Just jot down the words. And so at the end, you'll fill in a survey, give those words back, and we can go ahead and issue your CPE certificate and give you some credit for all the learning we're going to do. Also, definitely if you're joining online, you'll receive the survey immediately after through the software. Just make sure to turn off your pop-up blocker. That seems to be generally an issue sometimes if that's not off. And then I think this is just reiterating some of the CPE that we'll be issuing. All right, so I'm going to let Bob introduce our firm, tell you a little bit about us. So, Bob.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here once again in Baltimore. A little bit rainy and kind of not the weather I was expecting. In any event, our firm has been in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area for more than 30 years. We're proud to announce that we're now in the Baltimore area and moving up the East Coast to the New York area also as well. The majority of our clients are nonprofit in nature, and that could be 501c3, 501c6, 501c4 if you're political in nature, and many others, social organizations, et cetera. We have, at this point, I believe, 16 partners. 11 or so are audit, and the audit practice is 70 to 75% of our firm's business, and it is 95% driven by the nonprofit practice. So we also have a nonprofit tax department. So even though you may not be clients, we do urge people to reach out to us and say, we have a question, we just want to make sure we're doing the right thing, or this looks a little complicated, or are we bordering on something we shouldn't do? Feel free to reach out to us at any time. We're here as a resource and always available. That being said, this is an interesting topic. We probably spend more time talking to groups and working with our audit clients as well as other clients who reach out to us about the allocation of expenses, what's appropriate, how to do it, and that's what this seminar is going to be. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. The world is a little gray, or it's a lot gray and not black and white, even though the folks at your cognizant agency or oversight agency will tell you it's got to be this way. So, and a lot of what I ask today is, let's make this interactive, because I know everybody's going to have specific questions, but they're going to be similar in nature to others, but you may have a different agency who's the oversight agency. And so, and each agency is different, and they're becoming more and more difficult. I will tell you that day by day. That's okay. Jennifer,
Yep, let's get started. So first we're just going to dive right in, and you all have a copy of the slides in your packages, just in case you guys can't see it in the back. But we'll dive right into this concept of a functional expense statement. And this is unique to the nonprofit world. So, you know, this doesn't exist in for-profit entities and for-profit accounting. And so it's one of the unique accounting and financial quirks that comes with being a tax-exempt organization. And really, the concept of this statement or this functional expense allocation is by way a measure for an organization. And for-profit, a bottom line, a net income is a good measurement. And while nonprofits aren't measured that way, functional expense statements and allocations can really give a user of the financial statement a sense of efficiency and directly related to the mission. And so for those organizations that do have functional expense statements, right now, not all nonprofits are required to present a functional expense statement as part of their basic financial statements. So, for example, a lot of C6 organizations, associations, typically don't have a functional expense statement incorporated in their basic financials. However, the new FASB that's being released for the change in presentation for nonprofit organizations required to start being implemented in 2018 for calendar year end. So that's just around the corner. It is now a required statement of the basic financials. So if you don't have a functional expense or have never gone through this process, again, where we're finding a lot of that is in the association world, it will be a requirement and it will be coming down the line. And so making sure we really understand how we put one of these together. So this statement is really just a matrix kind of presentation where it shows both our natural expense costs, so our costs by salaries, rent, telephone, by natural expense category, and takes those and spreads them on a programmatic versus supporting services basis. So we would take those costs and spread them across our various programs or a supporting type of activity. And so ultimately what you get from doing this exercise is a sense that, you know, our supporting services creates kind of a ratio to what is being directly charged. And so that measure becomes this concept of measuring some sort of efficiency in the organization.
And this is a key point, because nowadays donors go online so often, whether it's Charity Navigator or GuideStar, and they look at the 990. And you have your functional expenses, and then it shows that your program service expense and your management in general and fundraising. And really they want to see how much is going to program services. I mean, I think there's this misconception, although it's getting better these days, that everything should go to program services and nothing should go to management in general and fundraising. People want to see, if they give $100, they want to know that 80 or 90% of that is going towards a program, not realizing that there is a cost to running the organization, and that's what shows up under management in general and fundraising. So when we see groups that have 60% under program services or something like that, or 50-50 for that matter, there's a stop. Let's talk about this. Because the public is looking at it, and donors will shy away from that. So while I urge as much as possible to get over into the left column, which is program services. There's a right and wrong, and we can't just shove it all over there. And there has to be an allocation methodology. There has to be a methodology as to how we come up with allocating certain costs. And if we talk about personnel, we talk about timesheets, or we talk about some other measurement of time, but we can get to that later. But just know that nowadays it's become so easy for everybody to just get online and see where you are. And they can go to, and generally I would say most of you here have your annual report on the website. You probably have your financial statements. And people look, and the first thing they're looking to see is how much money is going to the programs.
Yep, being that required part of the 990, and as Bob mentioned, that is exactly where the information for Charity Navigator and GuideStar are pulling that from, so straight from your 990. So it being a required piece of required disclosure, it becomes very easy to go and just get a quick ratio and then draw conclusions about that ratio. And so, you know, that's another conversation as to educating our users and how we're presenting that information. But anyway.
I mean, there are different ratios to look at, and I will tell you that as an auditor, when I look at my clients' financial statements and I see that management in general is less than 15% of my total expenses, then I might have a question about, are we staffed properly? Do we have enough capacity in finance, HR, IT, the administrative functions to run the organization that we're running? If it's over 25%, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to say are we overstaffed, but are we actually capturing our costs properly? I mean, there are questions that are raised. Anywhere between 15 and 25 is fine, in my mind. If you go below 15, it's a red flag. You go above 25, a little bit of a red flag on the other end. And I probably look for the optimal range somewhere between 18 and 21. That being said, there are caveats to this, because if you're a research grant organization and a lot of your expenses are just grants going out, it's, you know, your measurement's going to be off. And so you take things into consideration when you look at things, look at these ratios. But for us, or for all of us, I think we look at less than 15, kind of like, can we do what we want to do? And over 25, are we overstaffed, or are we just not capturing the cost properly?
Yeah, and sometimes it's more of a function of that maybe our methodology hasn't been looked at in years, and we're not actually preparing this statement correctly or based on an accurate basis of allocation. And so, you know, before the very first question we asked is, okay, let's get an understanding of how you did this in the first place. And so for you all to make sure we have clearly defined policies and procedures on what our direct costs are and how we're allocating, that's typically the first step. It's so often that we look at this and they're like, oh, I just did the same thing as last year, and you find out that no one's looked at this allocation statement or this methodology for who knows how long, and it's not an accurate representation and what it should be. And then in that case, we need to go back and redo it to accurately reflect how our programs are being run.
That, and I will also say, and we'll talk about this a little bit further, is that as I sit here around the table, and I know some of you, and I've spoken to some of you before, your largest expense more than likely is personnel related. And so sometimes I walk into organizations and say, you know, we just need to have a conversation with all staff on how to complete timesheets. I mean, your day isn't always administrative. I mean, there are times when you're working on programs and you have to think a little bit about the programmatic aspect of what we do. And so once a year, gather everybody together and say, okay, I just want to spend a half hour talking about how we think about allocating our time on timesheets. because this is driving, it's also driving the largest expense, but it may also drive a lot of the other allocations within the statements. And so it's something to always think about. And I think that staff generally work more programmatically than administratively at many of your organizations, I would say. So, sure.
I'm just curious how many people actually have staff that complete timesheets here?
We had, and my boss got rid of it. So now I have a package that I can do this every 2 weeks myself.
So do you do percentages?
I do.
So the question was in the room, how many organizations actually have their staff complete timesheets? And I would say, what, maybe like 80% raised their hand yes. And so, you know, this, and we'll talk a little bit about this for specifically federally funded organizations versus non-federally funded organizations. You know, there can be a little bit of leeway to how we track the information, and really, actually, under the new uniform guidance, even the federally funded, they took away the actual words of timesheets, you know, and so that used to be a requirement, but they now say that you can track it based on budget throughout the year as long as you are truing it up at the end of the grant agreement to actual. So what's the point of getting rid of the timesheets or changing that in the first place? So I know for us, we wholly encourage that if you have a timesheet system in place, that is really the best way to capture the after-the-fact determination of actual time spent working on the programs. And I know we have a couple comments.
Well, not a comment. I actually have a very different kind of question. So would you define M&G, Management General? Because I've seen what I would call Management General skin. And I've seen okay. So would you kind of lay that out a little bit, because I've seen various things people consider management general that I would not, and I've seen the other way around where people exclude things that I would consider should be in.
So the question is can we define management in general, and the comment being that, you know, we've seen things that one person might consider M&G and another organization might not consider M&G, and so there's a lot of varying opinions or topics, and I think this is exactly what Bob's talking about, that gray area out there, and I'll let Bob tell.
But here's the issue. Every group is going to be different.
Yes.
So let's start with that, you know, and just acknowledge that. But if you were to look at, we'll start with personnel and then I'll move on. But if you look at personnel, you know you have your finance department, you know you have IT, you may have your executive office, and you may have HR. For the most part, those are administrative in nature. Receptionist, you know, office personnel. For the most part, that's management in general. Most of your other people are probably programmatic in nature during the day, and they'll work on programs. Sometimes we see finance staff coding their time to manage to programs if they're doing specific reports for donors, and they can actually identify what I would. And then when you get to other costs, be it supplies, telephone, postage, unless you can specifically identify the cost as going to a program, I would say it's going to fall back into management in general. Now, put it in management general, we can always have an allocation back out, okay, which is what I would probably advise most clients. Capture it in management in general, and then we'll come up with an allocation to get these costs that were general in nature, but we'll get them back out to the programmatic side. But it's, if you buy 100 notebooks because you're putting on a presentation, it's probably programmatic. If you buy 100 notebooks for staff, probably administrative. You know, so it's can I identify the cost and specifically charge it to a donor? sometimes the donors have budgets within their grant agreements saying, here. And I want to get away from one thing. I don't think a program is not defined by whether we have funding or not. Okay, and so if I come back to the very beginning of what's a program, what's management in general, this is a conversation that I think should take place every year also before the timesheet. And then once we've defined the programs, then we go to timesheets. But I think every year you kind of sit down and say, what are the organization's programs? How do we define these? You know, are we doing a program in Southeast Washington? What are we doing? How's it benefiting? Are we helping children? I mean, is it broad in scope? And whether we have funding or not, it's a programmatic activity of what the organization's doing. So, and many times people shy away from putting costs there because it's not funded. And that's probably the wrong way to go about it. You need to know the cost of your programs, especially going forward. If you're going to submit a proposal, now at least you know the cost of running that program. So I urge everybody once in a while to sit down annually, and maybe annually is too often depending on what the organization does, but to sit down and talk through what our programs are. And then you move into timesheets. And the one caveat I have on timesheets is, while there's probably no better way to justify how time ends up somewhere, timesheets are an after-the-fact documentation of what we've done. You're not attorneys, you're not accountants, you're not billing by the hour, you're spreading your costs, but it's the best way we have of measuring what we do. And so, you know, just taking, because we submitted a grant and just saying, well, we have $10,000 under salaries in the budget, we're going to charge $10,000. That doesn't work. We need to know the true cost of the program. So you get your staff who are working on the program to record their time. Now, it can be after the fact, and admittedly, unlike us and unlike lawyers, timesheets are an estimate of your time. And I understand that, and it's fine. I mean, you know, nobody's perfect. It's going to be what it is. It's just, but there's got to be a way to capture what we do. So I start with, what are our programs? And they may change, irregardless of whether there's funding or not. Different issue. And then go to, and then as far as, like, it's almost easier to look at, coming back to your question, I'm sorry, but coming back to your question, if you have a cost that is, I would say general, obviously general in nature, but if it supports all programs of the organization, you know, telephone, office rent, you know, it supports the whole entity. Mm-hmm. We may allocate that at the end of the year. We may allocate some to programs mm-hmm. based upon how people spent their time, assuming they're in the office nowadays, which, you know, doesn't happen. But it's benefiting all the programs of the organization, and I would look at it that way. Okay.
Yep, and that's exactly, you know, what's captured on this slide. The direct costs specific to a particular program, and then indirect costs used by multiple activities in a very, like, you know, boiled down sense of the word. But just reiterating what Bob said, you know, in this process, one of the very first things that you would need to do is to define those programs, like, of the organizations. And more so, you know, those programs could have multiple grants under them. And so a lot of the times people get a little hung up on, well, each grant is a different program, or, you know, it's too detailed. And so the presentation gets a little murky, but it's really in multiple layers. Programmatic at the top, the grants and the other activities, non-grants, as Bob mentioned, that are funding those programs, and then the actual costs. And so making sure we have those clearly defined, well, one, that we know what they are, two, that they're clearly defined and we have some sort of documented methodology conclusion on how our organization is approaching this allocation. And so there are a couple ways that you can present an allocation. So the direct costs get charged, the cost to management in general get charged, and then the next step, as Bob has started to allude to, is taking that management and general pool and seeing of this pool what is benefiting multiple programs in the organization and allocating that back out so that the programs that are using the multitude of support costs for the organization get to absorb some of that cost. So we know the true full nature of running that program, not just the direct cost, but the administrative cost of running that program as well. And so that allocation can be presented, very technically on a statement in two different ways. We typically see an above the line or an below the line allocation. And so we have a couple examples of both that we'll show you and walk through. But before we get to that, we should really kind of touch more on that basis. So when we have that pool of management and general costs and we want to spread it to the programs, how are we going to do that? What are we going to use to make that allocation? And the most common answer to that is the salaries, the timesheets. We say that, it's the biggest cost of running a program typically. And so, if the time is the best estimator of what it took to run that program, that being the basis that we can use to spread the M&G costs. And so salaries becomes even more important as the basis for allocation.
And with that being said, Jennifer's right, it's probably the most common. However, what we're realizing as we're going forward, and I use that just because it's the most common because it's somewhat the easiest to look at, but nowadays I have to be careful because the workforce has changed and we may have people working all over. So if I have my office in Washington, D.C. or Baltimore, if I have my office here in Baltimore and I have 30 employees, but I also have some working from home in California, Connecticut, Washington, wherever, then the true cost of my salaries to allocate my rent is a little different. And it may not be an effective method for an allocation. And we're seeing this change consistently. And it's evolving because the workforce is evolving. And we're seeing rents are going down, space is being utilized differently. And so while it used to be the easiest way to allocate because my staff, everybody was in the office. Now that's not the case. Also, if you have programs in different locations, NDI has, 50 different locations, give or take, right? And so you can't have those salaries in because then it starts mixing things up also. So I think every group is a little bit different, and you just have to understand as you put together the allocation methodology, you have to come to an understanding of what makes sense for each organization. By far, salaries is the easiest and normal method for allocating costs. And as Jennifer mentioned a bit ago, we do see people allocating, supplies, on that line item for natural expense. You have supplies, and it's under program services A, program service B, management in general, fundraising, and then all the way across. And what happens is, fundraising gets an allocation of 1 or 2%, so you see $2 in fundraising. It's like, why are we doing this? And that drives accountants crazy also because it's like, So what I try to get my clients to do is just put it all in management in general. Let's come up with a pool that can be allocated out, one line item at the bottom. but that's different presentations for different groups. The other thing I will tell you, as you're defining your programs, fundraising is a program. Fundraising is a program, but for many of you, there's also development. Development and fundraising are vastly different. Development, we're trying to raise restricted funds for programs. Fundraising is raising unrestricted money. They're handled differently for indirect rate calculations. So if possible, I would urge splitting those into two different programs. The hard part is you have development staff, I'll call them development, resource development. Mm-hmm. So you have people who are in your resource development that are doing fundraising and development. So for them, they've kind of got to split their time between the two, if possible, because one is an acceptable cost and can go into the numerator. Fundraising goes in the denominator. We'll get to that part a little bit later. So they're vastly different. If any of you are political in nature and you do lobbying, that's a program. And also very important to keep track of your lobbying expenses for the 990. I think recently I had a client who's exceeded the lobbying limits, and now there's tax due and all sorts of other issues. So I would say, you may have legislative affairs as a program, but you may want to break that down even further to show lobbying, and lobbying is well defined under the IRS. There has to be a bill that's already pending before it's truly lobbying. Otherwise, legislative activities. So, but I would urge you to take a look at that, and if you have questions, that then becomes kind of a nonprofit tax issue more than a financial statement issue. But I would urge the programmatic aspect to kind of break that down if you do any of that.
Okay, great.
Sorry, I have a quick question about that, just because it's a little new to me. You said development is raising restricted money, fundraising is raising unrestricted money.
Generally, that's a great way to
think of them?
Yeah.
So when you're saying restricted for program, restricted, it will be in restricted net assets at the end of the year, or any of it?
It's restricted for programmatic use.
Okay.
Okay, so whether I classify it as temp restricted net assets, or whether it's a U.S. government program and it's shown as a refundable advance, it's restricted for programmatic use. Okay.
When you ask a question, if you could identify yourself, we want the folks on the phone to your part of the discussion. Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. My name is Janice Keith. I'm the Director of Finance Department.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, so the question was just defining more fundraising versus development, and development being raising funds for restricted program services, not necessarily temp restricted, but then fundraising being raising funds for unrestricted purposes. And so I know we did have a question on that online, so that kind of covered exactly what people were asking as well. And so just kind of going back to the basis for the allocation, Bob is right as far as like the timesheet's definitely the most common, but there are a multitude of different bases that can be used for allocating funds. And so, rent being one, square footage of space used for program staff versus finance staff, and that can be square footage over a multitude of locations. Whatever the case may be, we see that quite often. We also see a number of our clients and organizations use, if they're heavily participant-based. So, they have 4 or 5 programs with participants that are actively coming to events that they hold or programs that they're hosting. And so the number of participants for each of those programs is used as the basis for allocation, and so not salaries. And so there are a multitude of different bases that can be used, and it is very organization specific. And then even more so on the, again, for those organizations that aren't necessarily federally funded or maybe membership-based, it can also be more of an estimate. You have a little bit more leeway as far as what we're using. And so in many cases, if they are saying that we're using an estimate of time, that estimate might be done maybe quarterly or maybe once a year at the end of the year, you know, which is a lot looser than if you were receiving federal money or you're a see-through grant-funded organization. And so there are a multitude of different options out there and different ways to allocate those funds.
And for those groups that may be a little bit more, I don't want to say complicated, but they may have more than one location, or they may have a location where they're serving clients or beneficiaries, whatever the term you may want to use. There may be a methodology for allocating the costs associated with that office. You know, if you have a shelter where you're feeding the hungry, I mean, maybe the administrative costs within that building get allocated based upon, you know, how things are run out of that building. Mm-hmm. And then that rolls up into the allocation of the overall expenses of the organization. Very common to have, nowadays, very common to have more than one location, especially if, depending on the nature of your programs. I mean, you could have programs in many different areas, different cities or different locations. Mm-hmm.
So, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, Carla Wishenko, National Trust for Historic Preservation. Just a quick question about that allocation breakout between fundraising and development. We have our fundraisers currently who charge time on their timesheets to our national treasurers when they have been soliciting contributions for a national treasure. But generally, on their visits, they're telling a donor about the National Treasure Program, about the specific national treasure that might be in that donor's geographic area of interest, but they're also telling them about the rest of the work that the overall trust is doing. So how do you decide when they should be charging that time to that national treasure versus charging that time to fundraising, because they're really talking about multiple restricted programs but also unrestricted gift opportunities as well?
This comes up quite often. And I'm assuming that everybody heard the question. It's about when there's a general, the staff is out there asking for possibly an appeal for a restricted program, but also an unrestricted appeal, but also providing information on the organization as a whole. And that's where I have interesting conversations with people about how much is really fundraising. I mean, at what point have we stepped across the line and it's now fundraising as opposed to providing general information on the organization? I mean, in theory, if the first time we speak, you're telling me about the organization, I'd say that's not fundraising. And in many cases, when you go to donors, just because their title is resource development or fundraising associate or whatever it means, doesn't mean they should put all their time to fundraising. I mean, it may be public information and education is what I would, you know, a lot of what they do is public information and education. It's educating people about the programs of the organization. When they get to the specific ask and they spend an hour then or 2 hours saying, you know, we really need your help, or, you know, it's changed the conversation a little bit. Now you're asking, and now we're into fundraising. But I think a lot of what we do in the beginning, especially when we meet new people, we're probably not asking for money right away. We're educating the public on our programs. And so I think that can go into either public education or development. You know, it's more public information, if you will. Now, the interesting part about that is I would say that's probably a program. So, I mean, it may end up as a direct cost, but it may not be fundraising. And part of the you know, the way the world views fundraising is I don't want to give to fundraising. I don't want to give to an organization that has X% in fundraising. So maybe it's better shown as public education and information. So there's a fine line there, and each organization will evaluate this differently. But I don't believe, in my heart of hearts, the first time you meet somebody and tell them about the organization, you're asking for money. And so I think all staff members have to evaluate that. But I think it's a great thing to tell the staff.
Yep.
And again, how to complete their time or record their time.
Yep, and a lot of this, you know, it starts in the finance department as far as defining or with the organization, but then education internally to the staff and how to complete the timesheets and really making them understand what they're doing and making sure that the program people understand, you know, why it's important to track the cost and the way it's presented ultimately. And so, yeah, it ultimately becomes a lot of internal education throughout the organization.
Now, here's the only other thing I'll say about this is that once it's on a timesheet as fundraising, it gets hard to change it for an auditor. So, thus, talking to the staff occasionally about how to fill out timesheets is paramount to this, because once it's down there,
yeah,
it's kind of hard for us to say, nah, we're going to change it just because we don't like the number. So I would say education first, and tell the staff how to complete these things, or think about it before they just write down 8 hours a day.
Yep.
Johanna Seltzer, Atlas Performing Arts Center in Northeast DC. I'm just curious what you consider the optimal percentage for fundraising. You mentioned the one for M&G. I'm curious if you have one in mind.
So the question was, is there an optimal percentage for fundraising?
This one's interesting. I see this. Well, let me step back a second, okay? Because when I was talking about, it wasn't necessarily management in general that I was talking about. It was kind of supporting services as a total of my total expenses. So I would have management in general and fundraising. Okay, I don't want either. Those two numbers together, I don't want to go above 25%. Okay, so it's really supporting services. Now, how that breaks down between management in general and fundraising is interesting, because if I see very little in management in general, I'm probably going to come in your office and say, nah, this doesn't make sense because I don't know how you're running the organization. So it's generally 70-30, or at the high end. And then I see less and less under fundraising. But unless that's what you do. I mean, there are organizations that are solely set up to raise funds. But the concentration of that, let's say 18 to 21%, or below 25, the concentration's got to be management in general, because we have to run the organization. Okay. So, but when I see groups where it's 5 and 18 in fundraising, I'm going to come in and say, I don't think you can run this place on 5%. So, or tell me how you're doing it. How you do things as auditors who have a lot of experience in this area, whatever you do, there's probably going to be a question. And you may satisfy us, and that's the goal. But we look at different things, and everybody looks at things a little differently. But those are items we would look at. Okay.
Yep. So let's just give the first CPE word. It's indirect. Very original. So indirect. And then we're going to look at a couple examples. And of course, neither of these examples have M&G and the supporting services, fundraising and the supporting services. But we've gotten a couple more questions online about that fundraising and where it belongs and how it factors into the calculation. So if we just pause and look at this statement, we have our program services in the first column, and then we have this management in general column. So if we had fundraising, we would have a third column that says fundraising, and both management in general and fundraising are considered supporting services together, okay? And so that supporting services taken as a percentage of your program services is the basis for the calculation of what we're saying, that 18 to 25%. So fundraising would be included in groups with management in general in supporting services. I just wanted to clarify that because we've gotten a couple questions online about that. And then we've reiterated it here.
Don't leave the screen.
I am not. And then there's the question, well, if we have management in general, fundraising, and business development, we've taken that fundraising category and split it into fundraising and business development. So now we have 3, management in general, fundraising, and business development. Where does that fall, the business development? Does that fall under program or that supporting services again?
And I would probably recommend that I would probably not, some people can use business development. I like resource development, and then you can sort that out between development and fundraising. You could have, or you could have business development, and then you could have fundraising underneath it and development, the 2 connotations there. Whichever term you want to use, but it can be broken down.
Yes.
And there's no harm breaking it down as far as you'd like to go. But
business development stays in the supporting.
It's going to be under supporting
services
and
section.
Just because we call it business development,
correct,
resource development, development and fundraising, it's all supporting service of the organization under definitions for our purposes. Okay, so it's all going to be a supporting service. So it's going to be program services and supporting services, and it's management in general. That could be called administration, could be called a lot of things, but and then you have that. So those 2 numbers are what I'm trying to stay under the 25%. And this is a perfect example of this screen right here is a perfect example of this number right there saying, okay, what do we do and how do we do it? And there have been times where I have groups that nobody keeps timesheets. That's fine, but somehow I've got to get to a proper allocation, and I may sit down with the executive director, the CFO, and say, you know what, let's just list out everybody's W-2 for the last year. And now let's tell me what they do on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. Is it administrative? Is it not? Going with the assumption that probably 20% of their time is vacation or holiday, but we can throw that out and then that'll get allocated also. But but the question here is, I should, depending on the type of organization, I should not have almost 45% of my costs, my personnel costs, in under management in general. Doesn't make sense. I know the way most groups are run, they're generally short on staff. So, even the people who might be considered administrative sometimes are doing programmatic activities. So it's kind of, I look at this and say, come on, everybody, let's think about, where our time goes. And once I change that top number, then I change my benefits. Then I start changing my other allocations also. And all of a sudden, the numbers are coming back in where they should be. I mean, at 1.2 million, I should have 900,000 or more under program services. So it doesn't take a lot to get there, but it starts with salaries. And that's why we've mentioned it over and over. And timesheets, while they're great and all, as I said, there are other organizations that don't have them. So we may say, you've got a department, you've got an HR department, okay, that may be administrative, but you've got a programmatic staff, is that 100%? And then, we start filling up the boxes and just coming up with something that everybody can live with. And it may take, it may take an hour or two to sit down and go through this, but it gives you the basis of what's being done, and then you can refine it each year as you go forward.
Yep. So not much else to say on this, just as we look to the other one, you'll see the 2 kind of different ways to present the functional expense statement. This one doesn't have that below the line allocation. It's all done directly to the columns and the natural expense categories, whereas this one, we have the below the line, that $765,000 is what we've identified as the pool of costs that are shared costs of the organization and that we're spreading out to the programs. Go ahead, Bob.
And on this one, as I look at the statement of functional expenses here, the first question I have is, why is research and education not getting any overhead allocated to it? You know, and this may be fine. We're capturing all of our costs here, you know, et cetera, and all of the red is here, but then it's being allocated back out here. Again, if all the research and education, if this line were grants and this number was grants and it was all going out, I'd say that you could make the argument that that's fine. There's very little salaries here, but because we've almost got as much in salaries as we do here, why am I not getting any overhead? I mean, chances are that $331,000 probably has something to do with office space, equipment, you know, stuff like that. So in this case, I'd say the allocations, while the 765 number might be a good number, the allocation between the different ones might be different.
This is Sherry Peters from NDI. What would be the situation where you wouldn't allocate all of that $1,082,000 in general administrative? Are we supposed to assume that maybe some fundraising is built in there and they're not allocating the fundraising? Because, like in ours, we have.
Well, and I understand yours because you're doing it so that you come down to the indirect and it all goes out.
Right.
And that's another presentation, and I get that. This is a case where what we have here is, that's one way. I don't know that we have an example like that. But
I have maybe a couple that allocate 100% of their M&G costs at the end of the year.
Why isn't the whole $1,082,000 allocated out? Okay, and I have that with certain clients, so that the only thing left here might be expenses that are unallowable to be recovered by donors, and that's all that's left here. In many cases where it's not funded by U.S. government or restricted donors, usually the salary stays here. Usually I would take these costs and allocate these out as a percentage. Salaries, they say they're management in general for presentation purposes like this. In your case, allocating it all out, I understand. We have groups that do that, you know, but your costs are probably being captured and allocated.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I'm used to.
In this case, they're not. But I would generally start with 627. See, I'm not quite sure how I allocate. Obviously, this 765 number here includes some of the salaries. I'm not quite sure how I've allocated those out because I think they're administrative in nature, and I would generally leave those, assuming that those costs are tracked in some manner. I would leave those under general and administrative and allocate the other costs out. In your case, we're allocating everything out so that we know what the true cost of all our programs are. And that is another presentation, and I like that presentation, and people need that when they're preparing proposals for budgets or budget purposes in their proposals.
Robert, why would you leave the salaries behind? I don't understand that. I've never seen that.
What I'm, in theory, and this is just theory, if I have a total of $3.6 million in salaries, and let's see if people have kept timesheets, okay? And so I have $600,000 in salaries that are administrative in nature. Those are not a shared cost that I would allocate out, as these may be. You know, if I have some of these, this isn't the greatest example because normally I would generally say this has been captured where it is. Right now, if we want to allocate it back out to the programs, I think now we're getting into what Sherry mentioned, allocating out all these costs to get to the true cost of each program.
Right.
That's
Right.
a different presentation, or I come down to zero here.
Yes.
And two different presentations. One is for financial statement purposes and presentation maybe to the general public in our 990. The other, because I don't think in the 990 I'm going to come down to zero under management in general. Okay, but if I allocated all of the $1,082,000 out, I'd come down to zero, and we'd have our true cost of our programs all the way across. So two different methodologies.
I think you just answered my question, but I want to confirm, can it be a hybrid? Can it be some things are more directly allocated on the expense line and some items are pooled in the overhead allocation?
Yes. For example, if I look at rent here, we have rent under grants and healthcare, and that may be a separate office and it's all programmatic. And then I may have my office rent, over here, and that may get allocated out. So yes, generally speaking, and that's where I say every organization is a little bit different, and there may be multiple allocations that you go through.
Yep, and the importance of, just, and this is my auditor speaking, but, documenting your methodology helps. So there is a methodology and we've documented it and we can support it. That helps as far as when you do have an independent audit or grantors asking, about your rates, or when you submit a proposal, having that documentation that we've thought about our methodology. We know what's going into these. Here is how we're doing it. And a lot of times it's like, oh, great. The fact that you've even just thought about it and documented it is more than, more than satisfactory and more than a lot of groups. So, I always say come back to documentation as to how your organization is going to specifically approach your allocation. All right.
I wish, and I apologize for this, because maybe we can put together another sample.
Example.
Or another example where all of the costs are being allocated out. And that's actually, my general administration is $1,082,000, I slide that over based on some allocation method. It could be salaries. And then I know the true cost of my program, so that I know that grants and healthcare are now going to be, let's say, $4.5 million. When I go to a funder or a donor and I prepare a budget, or let's say I prepare several, I know that at the end of the day, and let's just say that it's 3.6 and 800,000 or whatever that percentage is, I should raise, if I prepare a budget for the donor, I should, whether it's $1 million or 3.6, but if it's $1 million or 500,000, I should get whatever that percentage of 800 of 30, 400, so it's 20 some odd percent. I should include that 20% in my budget because I need to recover that. I'm trying to recover everything to make my organization whole. And I'm not trying to gain I'm not going to get a profit out of my donors, but I want to make sure that I'm going to be whole here. Otherwise, I'm going to have to raise restricted money.
Yep. And then, Bob, we've had a couple questions online that are very similar, but going back to the concept of development and fundraising, it's a hot one. They're both very similar, but they're saying basically if we're taking development and fundraising and breaking it down, if they're both supporting services, what's the point of breaking it down? Like, why? Like, what's the point?
Well, 2 points. And one is if you're funded by the U.S. government, I'll come back to that, because it'll change your indirect rate.
Yeah.
Because development becomes part of the numerator, fundraising is part of the denominator. So that's one reason to break it out. The second reason is put it on your 990, maybe development goes back into management in general, and it's not shown as fundraising. People look at fundraising. People do look at fundraising, and remember the 990 has 3 columns for their expenses.
Yep.
And so, or even on page 1, they just break it down between the 3. And so they look at fundraising as this evil thing that they don't want to fund, recognizing that every group has to do this. You know, so the more money we put in fundraising, the connotation is, do I really want to give to a group that has 20% in fundraising, when if I slide it over into management in general and say it's development, or, you know, it's really part of my indirect management and general costs, you know, maybe that's a better presentation. So, you know, my tax guys might yell at me and say, no, it's all fundraising, but, you know, I may argue with them and say, no, no, no. So that's a reason also.
Yep.
I mean, I just, it's public perception of what is really fundraising and what we're doing as fundraising. And it's only because the general public just cringes when they see a big number under fundraising. Was there another question?
There's lots of questions, but we'll get to.
And mind you, I deal with the indirect branches at several agencies on a day-to-day basis, and I'm just getting in trouble left and right.
Yes, there is a little bit of that. All right, so I think we've kind of touched on everything here, just the general importance of. So, well, we've talked about this functional allocation, and so the next several slides we'll talk about coming up with a rate, an actual indirect rate, like a percentage, a measurement tool. And we'll start with some non-federal, but then we'll spend a lot of time on those organizations that are federally funded and kind of how we work through that process. And so, you know, the rate, this percentage that we get, is really just a device to determine how much a program, how much administrative cost a program should bear. Okay, and so it's boiled down into this percentage. So, you know, there's the internal purpose of this rate, so understanding, you know, how much it costs to run the programs, and more so for externally when we're applying for grants, that we are factoring in this overhead as part of our proposal, because it's very important, it becomes very important for organizations to be able to recover those costs, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, but ultimately, you know, if we're not able to recover those costs, we are putting ourselves in the position where we are using other funds, other unrestricted monies to subsidize the overhead if we can't fully recover those costs. And so, you know, we've talked a lot about what the proper rate is for the organization and, you know, what the public's perception is. Is my rate too high or too low? Go ahead.
Hold on. I'm going to throw everybody for a loop right here, because now we're talking about indirect rates.
Yeah.
And this is going to be vastly different than the 25 and 15 I talked about earlier. The 25 and 15 as ratios that we look at is based on your total expenses. So you take management in general or supporting services and compare it to your total expenses. Now we're getting into indirect rates, and the calculation for the indirect rates is going to be your management in general over your program services and fundraising. So now this percentage is going to be vastly different than the 15 or 25%. And so there's a difference here, and it's a math issue, but it's not a way that I would look to measure an organization. Because rates here, the indirect rate, and many of the organizations, many of the federal agencies that issue rates to organizations, you know, they may be up, down, they're all over the place. But this is not something the public looks at. They're generally pulling it off of your 990s, you know, and GuideStar and all these other places have this. So we've now moved into an indirect rate area, and the calculation is different. so the rates are going to be different.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. The allocation is a very different, is a measurement of efficiency, where a rate, is just used as a tool to see how much programs should bear of the administrative costs. And so one's a measurement and one's a tool. And so, yes, very different and calculated very differently.
And now, is the rate too high? Is the rate too low? No. Now you're into your competitors.
Yes.
And what, since we're all trying to raise the same, we're all trying to raise funds, but from the same donors, per se, same donor base. So the question becomes, if organizations A and B have rates of 20% and mine's 30, I'm losing a competitive edge, and I'm probably not going to get what I should get. If it's too low, I may get a lot of money, but maybe I'm losing money for the organization because I've calculated this incorrectly. This one is hard because you're basing it off of your actual expenses, but also trying to compare it to your competitors who you're, and as I said, everybody's competing for the same dollars to some extent. So it's a little bit tough in that respect.
Yep.
So the public perception, I think, is out on that one, but the too low, too high is very important to your organization.
Yep. So let's just quickly talk about the indirect rates and non-federal, or recovery of overhead costs with non-federal grants and agreements. And so, typically organizations have foundation, if you have some sort of foundation funding, and a lot of organizations nowadays also receive foreign government funding, so from like CETA and DFID or foreign governments. We've seen a lot of that lately. And so what we typically see with those is a very low cost recovery with respect to, what your actual burden would be to administer the program. A lot of times they are capping rates at a very low level, and especially the foundations have been notorious for this in the past, and I think they're getting a little bit better from what we've seen, but only giving 7% when it takes 15 to run that program, that happens quite often.
Yeah, and we have the benefit of going from organization to organization and seeing, foundation funding from many different places. Gates Foundation, which we all know, they've actually ramped theirs up to 15%. They're being reasonable at this point. It may not cover everything, but you're getting closer. I can tell you that some of the foreign governments don't want to give you anything. If you work for any of the UN agencies, you're looking at 7%.
Yep.
So
And that's it.
I'm Terry Wallace, Director of Finance and Administration for MHPI. We have healthcare grants, and they're doing about 13 to 14%. But based on salaries, my rate for that is about 27%. But we're not really concerned about that because the grant is covering some highly paid people.
So then we get into what's up here is, can we move more of these into direct costs? And so what I think you're alluding and speaking to, that a lot of these salaries are actually being directly funded by your grants, and so therefore, are charged directly to the program and really don't factor into that other, whatever other pool or rate that we're saying is G&A and administrative. And so, yeah, when we talk about these foundations and foreign governments giving capped rates or lowers, really, is there a way, a mindset, again, to take a look at what we think needs to be charged to the program to run it, and should those be built into the budget of this proposal for those foundations and foreign governments as direct costs as opposed to indirect costs? And so I think that's a little bit of what you're speaking to.
And when I look at this right here, and we talked about foundations, we talked about foreign governments, we talked about all donors are a little bit different. The federal government, generally speaking, can be your best donor because they're going to pay your actual rate, right? Now, what the most important piece that I'm going to speak to on this page right here is what's your organization's rate? Let's say it's 20%. Let's say 20. And we know the Gates Foundation is going to give you 15%. We're short 5%, okay? Now, and let's say it's $1 million grant, right? Now, do we have the ability to raise $50,000 of unrestricted money to cover the shortfall between 20% and 15%? My math might be off slightly, but it's close enough. We all because my direct costs are only going to be $800. Anyway, do we have the ability to raise that money? And I have a phone conversation this afternoon scheduled for 1 or 1:30 on this exact same issue with a client, and the answer might be walk away from the grant. If we don't have the ability to, and we don't have the experience or the ability to raise money to cover that shortfall, ultimately you will bankrupt the organization because you can't take grants where you're not going to recover your full overhead. And if you don't have the ability, either through your board or through your donor base, to raise unrestricted money to cover the shortfall, unfortunately, the right thing to do might be to walk away from that grant. And that's a hard thing for people to do, especially your development folks who are like, I got a $4 million proposal that we're going to get, but we're only getting 10% overhead. So this comes up, and this is becoming harder and harder as everybody, again, is competing for the same dollars. And not everybody has the luxury of raising a lot of unrestricted money. I mean, there are groups out there that raise a ton of unrestricted money. They're well known. They've been around for 100 years. It's a fundraising machine. Not everybody's like that. And so that's one of the things that, and that's my biggest takeaway from here is there's, unfortunately, you sitting around the table, most of you are in finance, it's your job to say no, as much as people don't want to hear it, we can't do this. And I'm not advocating that because more times than not, I'd like to see a solution because the program aspect of it is usually great, but there is the financial side. So that is my takeaway from that slide.
All right, so that's kind of all we wanted to say on the non-federal. What? Do you guys want to take a break, like a 5-minute break? Yeah. So, all right, we're going to take a 5-minute break, 7-minute break. So let's start again at like 10:17.
I have an interesting exchange with them.
All right, so yay, welcome back. Definitely needed the break, so good idea. So we have a couple, we'll start with a couple of the questions that we've gotten online, and actually we just want to acknowledge that for those that are online, they've been sending in a lot of their stories on how, you know, what we've been talking about is happened to them or directly, you know, attributable to the work that they're doing. I know one discussed about like moving those costs directly to be able to charge to the funder more in the direct base versus the indirect. So we've gotten a couple people say, yes, we were able to do that and ultimately benefited us even more so than we could have if we applied our federal NICRA rate. So that's a great example. So just some of the other questions that we've accumulated throughout the first half of this is, first, can we speak on the CEO's salary and benefit allocation? If all of it is captured under management in general initially, can it be reallocated? And yes, absolutely. And usually, you know, that's one of the big areas that if we come in and we see that it's very high, that salary number in the M&G column, and we start talking to people throughout the organization, especially the executive team, about what they do, you find that a lot of what they do is program-based and should be allocated accordingly. So generally, yes, the answer to that question. So this one is, if we allocate everything out of G&A, how do we present the costs that are indirect and G&A? And so I think maybe on that presentation, if we're doing something that's below the line, it's actually relatively easy to identify what your G&A pool is because it's the subtotal prior to the allocation out. And so you would still be able to know what your pool of G&A and indirect is before allocating it out. And then again, it goes back to a different methodology if we're allocating out 100% to see the true cost of running all our programs versus leaving a little bit of it in there for maybe the administration, different presentations. And so I think we've talked about that.
Yeah, I would, that presentation that was up there,
yeah,
that showed the $1,082,000, then you'd have the allocation. I think you stay with that and you recognize that the $1,082,000 gets you down to what you want to show.
Yep. On
one page, and maybe on the other page you've got your total programs costs.
Can you run through an example of calculating and charging? Yep, we have an example at the end that we'll go over. And then what is the difference between travel and entertainment and meetings and conventions? Is travel, entertainment, mileage, food, meetings, conventions, lodging, seminars the same? So that's just an organizational preference on what you want to call things or how you want to charge, you know, different direct cost categories. So taking a look at what your chart of accounts really and your expense categories and defining what's going to go in there, that's an internal decision. And so making sure that you've gone through that exercise and that you have clearly defined what the difference between travel, meetings and conventions or lodging, but ultimately, you know, that's dictated by you all in your definitions. All right. So let's get into a discussion for the indirect rates under the federal standards. And so we should all be well aware now that the guidelines, the regulations that used to be under OMBA 133 changed. I guess it's been almost 2 or 3 years, 3 years now. To the new Code of Federal Regulations, CFR 200, or what we just refer to as uniform guidance. And so with the new UG regulations came a couple of changes in the indirect related activities. Who is covered? So UG, technically if you receive any federal funding and expend it, you are supposed to be complying with the rules. But the people that get audited under an additional compliance examination is if you expend over $750,000 in your fiscal period. And so with that, you are required to have this additional examination where we do take a look at those specific federal grants and agreements and pick programs to test for those compliance terms and conditions. And so which awards are covered? Typically, we're talking about cost reimbursable grants and cooperative agreements. And so sometimes you might receive fixed federal funding. Those aren't typically subject to the rules and regulations that are subject under uniform guidance, as are the cost reimbursable ones. So the part of uniform guidance that gives guidance on the indirect rates for nonprofit organizations is in Appendix 4. And so it's actually, I really like the new rules and regulations. They're very easy to navigate. And so if you were to ever just go online and type in uniform guidance and pull up CFR 200, it's laid out very nicely and very easy to navigate. And at the bottom is Appendix 4, which discusses indirect rates for nonprofit organizations. And so in general, just some terms that we like to go over, when first thinking about overhead rates for federally funded organizations, allowability. So we'll go through a couple examples of allowable direct and indirect costs, and then conversely, we'll talk about a couple examples of unallowable direct and indirect costs. And so making sure we clearly know what is allowable in both of the numerator and the denominator, whether the cost and the methodology are reasonable, consistency, and consistency not only in the way that we treat costs, so whether a cost is treated as direct or indirect, but consistency in the application of our NICRA rate or whichever rate we are applying, and allocability and the ability for those costs to be allocated.
And I will say that those 4 items haven't changed.
Nope.
They've been there since I probably have been working with the U.S. government before A133 and, going back in time. These are the standards, and probably the consistency one is probably the most important one, that everybody wants you to be consistent. I mean, the reasonableness one, we usually all meet. It's very rare that we have a nonprofit where we have some unreasonable costs. It happens occasionally, but that's rare. The allowability, I mean, that's pretty easy because there are set things that they're not going to allow. So, but the consistency one is one that they're looking at. And we may run into a little bit of a conflict as we go from financial statement presentation to the indirect rate calculation. And we'll talk about that.
So there are a couple different types of rates that you would be allowed to use under uniform guidance. So maybe we talk about the NICRA last.
Either way, all 4 of these are interesting in themselves. Most nonprofit organizations that have federal funding generally have an approved NICRA from whichever agency that is funding them. And for the most part, most of my clients, just me personally, not the firm, but At this point in time in my life, it's generally the Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development. The Department of State, which is interesting in and of itself because they farm everything out to the Department of Interior. So I've got organizations that are implementing programs all over the world, and their rates being approved by the Department of Interior. So, but having a NICRA is generally, it's provisional 1 year, and then you submit it the next based on your actual, and then your figures have to be adjusted to the actual, and your actual rate then becomes the new provisional rate. All of this goes back into the federal database. The federal government is mandated to use the last NICRA that's on file with them. So, for instance, if your rate is dropping, you may want to take your time submitting the new one. For budget purposes, because every new grant award you're going to get is going to have the one that's on file with them. If your rate is going up, you may want to get it in quickly or even submit a new application for something like that. The chicken and egg thing that I have here, which is funny, is that if you don't have a NICRA, they won't give you one until you have an award that has a NICRA component to it in the budget. Now, the budget's not going to have the NICRA because they don't. So around and around you go trying to get them to give you something. And this is a little bit older. Hopefully 2 CFR 200 solved this problem by coming up with the de minimis of 10%. They're supposed to now give you 10%. Although just the other day, I had a client that has 7%. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what's going on. So there's every agreement now at a minimum should have 10%, and I say at a minimum, but I have groups whose rate is lower than 10, and they're like, well, I'll just take the de minimis, and they're like, no, you have a rate on file, you have to stay with the rate, even though it's 8% instead of 10. So
yeah, so okay, so let's just clarify a couple of those things. So under the uniform guidance, they came out with this concept of this de minimis rate. And it says that if you don't have a negotiated rate, that ultimately you can charge your funders 10% no questions asked regardless of what your actual rate is, okay? Now, in practice, that's what the guidance said. There's some things that have come up in practice where we'll talk about that. But the negotiated rates, if you have a negotiated rate under the new uniform guidance, funders, whether it's a rate with aid, if you're getting a DOE grant, DOE needs to recognize your NICRA and give you that. That is what the new standards say, that all federal agencies are required, in theory, to give you what your negotiated rate says. And so, we have come across a couple instances where in practice that's being challenged, or, the funders or the level of funders that are approving that aren't educated enough on the new regulations to know that that is technically a requirement. And so clients, or organizations should know that to be able to push back and make sure they're recovering what they're entitled to recover. Then the guidelines said if you didn't have this NICRA, that they should give you an automatic 10%. And so a couple of situations have come up, which we found interesting, that, is this 10% an option or is it a requirement if you don't have a NICRA? And the guidance has that at least the way that we have interpreted the guidance, that it's an option, that it's not a requirement to charge the 10%. And so we've had a couple funders that say, no, you either need to apply for a NICRA or 10% is the rate. And where it becomes an issue is those organizations that have been up until now just direct charging all their costs. They're not getting a rate, and so they 100% direct charge. That's what's been approved by the budget and the funder. And so ultimately with all of this, you know, what the takeaway is, again, especially in the gray area between what the technical guidance says versus what's happening in practice with the funders, is to fall back on communications with your direct funder and get those correspondences in writing, as far as if you are allowed to direct charge the grant, or, you know, they're accepting a different rate, or, you know, they don't need you to go and apply for a NICRA. Those things should be documented in writing, especially if they're out of the ordinary and what the regulations are saying.
And how are you calculating 10%?
It's not a calculation. It's a given number that the federal guidelines said 10%.
So if you've got $1 million grant,
I see.
There are exceptions.
Yes, direct.
It's on total. It's modified.
Modified
total
direct.
So they're going to take out capital equipment. They're going to
Right.
take out participant costs. They're going to take out subrecipients, except for the first 25.
25,000.
It's actually a way to get indirect for groups that didn't have this. Now, in theory, and practice also, is that if you have subrecipients and you give money to subrecipients, you're supposed to include this also in your subrecipient budgets. So I know some groups here do a lot of subrecipient work and give money to a lot of people all over, and they're supposed to now get 10%.
I have to say that when I worked at Hartley House, we just started submitting the 10%. Every time a grant would come up and we'd renew it, we would write in the 10%. And some of our funders responded back, you can't do that. And then we quoted these regulations to them, and we were able to get that 10% in each one of our new grants.
Yep, so the comment is that we've had, there was some here with a situation where they did start submitting the de minimis in all their budgets, and the funders pushed back, but ultimately, upon quoting the regulations, they were able to get it. So exactly, going back to, you know, the funders not being educated on the new requirements is a big piece of it. So making sure you're aware and to be able to push back and get, you know, what your organization is entitled to, this most certainly is an option out there, and so that's a great example. Go ahead.
I had a quick question. So if you receive money, let's say from the Department of Interior, and you have a NICRA, they will honor that NICRA. Then if you turn around and pass that money on to a subrecipient, if they have a NICRA, do you honor their NICRA rate?
Technically,
yes.
yes.
If they don't have a NICRA, then it would be 10%.
It could
correct.
be 10%. That is
so
absolutely
your rate
correct.
is only valid for...
Yep, so the whole concept of all the requirements in uniform guidance are passed through at every level. So the UG requirements, you know, talking about NICRAs, even talking about procurement or subrecipient monitoring, like things like that change at each level that needs to happen. And so correct, your NICRA would be honored by your direct funding agency and vice versa. If you were funding another organization, you would have to honor their NICRA or build in that 10% to the budget if that's what they choose. But go ahead, Shannon.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
So then does that, if the federal money trickles down to the city or state level, do they have to honor our NICRA?
Should.
Technically, they should, yeah.
Should. They should. They should. That's going to be a little bit harder.
Yeah,
You're dealing with cities and states.
Yeah, I can tell you that I came more recently from the state of Florida, and the state of Florida will not pay more than 10% for
Yeah.
a grant.
Yeah.
Every contract. Right.
Yep. So this is the difference between, you know, the in theory and then what you see in practice. And so, you know, it's good to know. And the comments are a number of organizations here. The state, like if you're passing through the states aren't acknowledging the NICRA and really capping the indirects at what they see fit. So.
I mean, the other two types of rates that you see on here are fixed and predetermined. You don't see fixed very often. Occasionally, and it's nice, but it's generally for groups that don't have a history, and they'll say, well, we're going to give you $75,000 and it's fixed. That's the fixed rate. So it may not state the percentage many times. They'll just give you an amount that's fixed. On the predetermined, and this is where things are getting a little bit easier for some, many of the federal agencies are issuing predetermined rates for a couple of years so that we don't have to go through the mechanism of calculating this every year, because the amount of time it takes, think about this, if you do your internal financial statements, the auditors come in, they audit this, then you go through and maybe your indirect rate changes a little bit, then your revenue recognition changes a little bit, then you submit it, then you get a new provisional for the next year, and you go through the whole thing. So now what they're doing is they're saying, you know what, we're going to give you a provisional rate for the next 2 or 3 years. Okay. And it does save time and effort in those in-between years. Now, when you get to the end of your predetermined rate period, you've got to go through the same process again. But I've had groups that are successful in this, and it is dropping down the amount of time involved significantly when you don't have to do this every year.
Yeah, just and I get the most common one that we see is the provisional and the final, and so I just want to make sure everyone understands what that provisional rate means. And so you get this rate approved by your cognizant agency for your fiscal period, and it's labeled provisional. And let's say it's 20%, and of course you submitted the application to prove that 20%. So during the year, whatever awards are awarded to you, you draw funds, cash down at that additional 20% that's been approved. So that rate is just a method that you are allowed to draw cash at. What happens with the provisional rate that oftentimes organizations don't understand is that at the end of your year, at the end of your grant period, you need to go back and calculate what your actual rate is and true up your expenses accordingly and your revenue recognition ultimately accordingly based on your actual rate. So whether it be more or less than 20% what you've been drawing at for the year, drawing cash down at for the year, you are going to either owe or get money back based on your final rate. And oftentimes groups do not understand that the provisional is truly just a provisional, and that final exercise needs to happen before the grant closes out. Or what happens often is that you don't realize that, and come audit time or come a year later after the grants have been closed out, you realize you charged the government too much and you owe a lot of money back to them.
Taxes.
Or if you're not, or if you're not monitoring it throughout the year, you're drawing all of your funds down when you could have, modified that accordingly and fully recovered. But because you've drawn all the funds obligated, you now can't recover anymore. And so you're left again with a shortage of being able to have to subsidize because you didn't fully recover what your actual rate was. So the provisional, and the challenge with the provisional in practice, again, is that it's so delayed. By the time we get the provisional rate, calculate our final rate, get approved for the final rate, it could be a year or two later. And so do we go back and open grants that have been closed out in the meantime at the provisional rate, or do we only do this for our open grants and adjust those accordingly? And so it comes up a lot, and it is challenging in practice just because the process takes so long to delay, or with the delay. But it is still the most common kind of tool method used out there that we see.
And one piece of advice, the U.S. government has different groups that review everything, and they may send you a piece of paper that says they want to close out this grant award, but your indirect rate hasn't been approved for that year. Don't sign anything until everything's approved for that fiscal year. So just take that piece of paper and just put it on a tray. And and I'll tell you that some of the indirect branches right now are way behind, and falling farther behind. And so I've got clients that are sitting with 5 years worth of pieces of paper saying, we want to close this out, we want to close this out. And it's just like, don't sign it. You can send them a nice note saying, sorry, indirect rates haven't been approved for these fiscal years. It's a little bit frustrating on everybody's part. At one point, probably 2 or 3 years ago, I thought everything had gotten much, much better with many of the agencies. It seems to have taken a step backwards. I think a lot of it has to do, unfortunately, with the change in administrations. There are a lot of people who left or retired, and there's just openings, and things aren't getting done as quickly as they should be.
All right. So this is direct from the guidance, from the uniform guidance, the different methodologies. So simplified methodology just being that the organization's major functions benefit from the indirect costs approximately the same degree. So if you really only have like one programmatic activity with multiple grants underneath, the theory here being that you could evenly spread those across the grants, just evenly.
And generally speaking, most agencies are in this column. They want to use this column because what it's doing is it's getting all of their players to submit their request for funding in a same manner, if you will. They're trying to get everybody to use the modified total direct cost as their base, and it's very simple. The multiple allocation base, you see this generally when there's more than one office. So for large groups that may have regional offices around the country or around the world, you would have steps and maybe possibly different rate bases. The last one is the direct allocation method. Jennifer mentioned this a minute ago.
Yep.
It's where basically all your costs are charged direct because all you have is federal funding. So that one's kind of out. But the simplified method, I come back to that. Everybody's coming back to they want the rate calculated in a similar manner. It's making their lives easier when they get requests for proposal or requests for funding. And I get it, but there are still groups out there where their NICRA is predicated on salaries, the denominator is salaries, benefits, and consultants. And in their cases, the rate may be 75 or 80% or even 90. And so they're trying to, they have a hard time. This group has 90%, but it's only on salaries. This group has 20%, and it's on total cost. So they're trying to get everybody to do it the same way. Unfortunately, there's a lot of groups out there, and not everybody does it the same way.
Yep.
But I will tell you that if you're starting the process, you're going to end up with the simplified method. There may be exclusions, there may be multiple steps involved, but that's probably where you're going to end up.
So I'll just say the second CPE word is rate. So for online, the second CPE word is rate. All right, so with the federal, so we're gonna kind of walk through a couple of the costs, and then we've got an example in the back of calculating an indirect rate. And so defining elements of cost. So here we just jotted down total cost for the financial statements, your audit report, total direct costs and total indirect costs. So, you know, the theory is that your financials or your statement of functional expense that we took at the very beginning or went through at the very beginning would become the basis for you calculating this indirect rate with modifications, and we'll get to what those are in a little while. But program costs being the total direct costs and supporting services being the total indirect costs. And so
and before we slide off here, okay, I have lots and lots of clients who, for financial statement presentation purposes, may show some of their administrative costs or indirect costs as allowable by the U.S. government, may show them as a direct cost or a program service in their audited financial statements, because that's what's going out to the general public on their website, on their 990, et cetera, et cetera. So then you have this reclassification back from the financial statements back to indirect, from direct to indirect. So in many cases, you can have your financial statement presentation be a little bit different than your indirect rate calculation. Now, I say that, and it just raises questions with the agency. They're like, well, prove to me why these are being reallocated back. So it just is a footnote that, you know, why were these costs included in the direct column, you know, blah, blah, blah. But it happens. Yes.
Julie McDill-Marama, what would be the advantage? What's the advantage of moving them out? I mean, why not just do what you do in the 990s? Why do you want to have them in that indirect?
The short answer is these may be they may be true administrative costs that we are just showing over in the program side for financial statement purposes. Maybe they're not funded, but if we slide them over to the indirect, our indirect rate will be a little bit higher, and maybe we'll get a little bit of funding from the federal government on the programmatic, on our grants. Depends. You know, I have a lot of groups that want to show financial statement presentation, you know, where they're pushing the programmatic aspect, and sometimes I'm, you know, again, this raises questions both ways, but one is out to the public. Your indirect rate is really just going to the federal government for approval, and your rate could be a little higher. If you're majority funded by the U.S. government, you'd like that rate to be a little bit higher.
Just for cash flow purposes? Well,
not just cash flow, but I mean at the end of the year, you know, again, the U.S. government is generally pretty good because they'll pay your actual rate. You know, so if you have indirect costs being shown as a direct cost, and you can move them back over, and there's got to be a reasonable justification, then your indirect rate will go up a little bit, and you'll collect a little bit more. It's not the best idea in the world, but it happens. More and more, I see this happening more and more. I try to get my clients to get away from this and say, just present your program costs over here, your administrative costs over here.
And it might be a situation where it's a
it could be a one-off
thing where you truly do want to move it out of your base, like a huge over expenditure on a program or something. You lost $400,000, you know, that it's not recoverable as far as, you know, bad debt or anything like that, but could truly affect your rate drastically. And so maybe that year it is a good idea to allocate and move them. And so it could happen.
Generally speaking,
yeah, it
raises more questions than it answers. And that incremental increase in funding between 20 and 21% is probably not worth the headache you're going to go through answering all the questions. So, you know, you know, I understand that the presentation of how we spend our resources and what we present to the public may be vastly different than what we're presenting here.
So we have a couple items of costs on here. And then it continues on to the next page as some typical allowable costs. But going back, for the select items of costs, you know, we've talked a lot about salaries. But one thing, or the numbers 3 and 4, we started to mention, and Bob mentioned this idea of modified total direct cost base, and this becoming more of a standard, and what we see typically as far as the basis within a lot of our clients. But, you know, that includes this factor of the sub-grants or sub-awards and the equipment and other capital expenditures. So oftentimes what you'll see is that you're backing out any sub-awards in excess of the first $25,000 of that sub-award. And so, you know, the concept being that you're going to recover overhead or indirect on $25,000. And so if you're flowing money through to another organization and you have $1 million that you've passed through, only $25,000 of that million is allowable in the basin. So that's part of the definition for the modified direct base that's under the uniform guidance.
And just as an aside, this probably bothers me more than anything else within their regulations, because if any of you give money to a subrecipient, you know that it costs a lot of money to monitor a subrecipient. And to get, let's say your rate's 20%, to get 20% on the first $25,000, and let's say it's a 1.5-year award, you get $5,000 for that. Congratulations. So for anybody that does a lot of subrecipient work or gives money to a lot of groups, I would say you're going to have to come up with a subrecipient rate, which is a whole nother thing that we haven't really talked about. But it's for those groups that do a lot of subrecipient funding, and it's going to require your staff now to track their time for the subrecipient monitoring, because you're going to come up with a separate rate for that, which is allowable, and the rates generally fluctuate anywhere from 5 to 7.5%. But I hate this. I think it's not reasonable, but I didn't get to make. They didn't want to hear from me when they wrote these. And I know that the number 4 here about equipment and other capital expenditures is an issue that comes up. I can tell you this comes up consistently with a lot of groups. There's an exclusion where you take this out, and that's fine. And I'm okay with this. You buy vehicles for $50,000 for your program. That's fine. And so, you take it out of the calculation. No issues with that. You're writing one check for $50,000. The time on the procurement probably wasn't that significant. It's okay. What certain agencies are saying is, why wasn't it capitalized? Why are you charging it direct to the program? Okay, a couple of things.
This will start a whole new conversation.
I know that, and but a couple of things, because I've had this recently, and I'm dealing with it. And the argument is, you may have a grant that only runs for 1.5 years. And so why would I capitalize something over 4 years or 3.5 or 3 to 5 years when my grant only goes for 1.5 years? That's not reasonable. And so, it's and why they call it a NICRA? Because that first word is negotiated. Everything is negotiable.
Yeah.
But this comes up a lot. But I would tell you the reason is a lot of the grant agreements are not going to be the same start and stop period that your asset is going to be capitalized. And if they want you to use depreciation, you're just going to get, fine for financial statement purposes, I get it, but the depreciation and tracking it and taking out of the indirect calculation is going to be more headache than it's worth.
Yeah, we will warn you, this does come up quite often, and the agencies are asking why things are being expensed directly to the programs when your policies and within the uniform guidance say that $5,000 is the threshold to put in place capitalized assets. And so they're looking at it. And so, you'll get differences of opinions, but being the one argument being a short-term grant, why aren't I expensing it? Or if the useful life isn't beyond the grant, why can't I expense it now? Or are we not going to be able to draw the funds down because it's not in the expense of the grant and be reimbursed for those capitalized items? And the answer is typically no, you can still draw the funds if they're capitalized. But then the agencies are saying, well, these are your policies, and the guidance does say you should be capitalizing these items and then recovering, through the depreciation. And so there are two completely different arguments. We've seen it questioned a bunch recently. Go ahead.
I'm pretty sure the guidance also says that if it's approved in your budget by the donor as the direct cost, then it
in theory, that's what I go.
Exactly.
That's what I go by. But there's a lot of pushback, and I would agree with you because the revenue. It's not just this side. It's not just the expense side. It's the revenue recognition that gets thrown off. And it's not as if I'm going to show a profit under this program. So it doesn't necessarily make sense in a lot of ways. I just want everybody to be aware that there is pushback. There's probably no right or wrong, and you have to do what's right and in consultation with your auditors. And but by capitalizing it and then depreciating it, you're creating a whole separate issue because you're drawing the funds down in advance to pay for it, and then you've got the revenue recognition issue, and especially if the time period of the grant isn't the same period that you're capitalizing it. And this gets complicated, and it's easier to keep it simple and just say, it was in my grant budget, I bought a vehicle, I expensed it, I don't own it anyway, I probably have to give it back at the end of the grant period, so there you go. Yeah. I know that some of the people within an agency that I won't name downtown who was pushing this tremendously has since left, so that's gotten easier.
It does come up. They are looking, so just be mindful of that. Let's flip over to some allowable.
You have a question?
I'm curious why you have occupancy costs and travel costs up there. I'm sorry.
Nothing unusual.
Nothing unusual.
Yep.
And the other thing I will mention is that I believe it's subpart E in 2 CFR 200, which has all the cost principles, and they have the selected elements of cost in there. Occupancy is only there because it's usually a large item, and it can be allocated. It can be, you can keep it where it is. You can allocate it out. I don't know. Travel costs. There's a lot of rules and regulations that go with the travel costs, and that's all I would say about it, depending on where you're traveling. They've gotten rid of, for those that work in foreign lands, they've gotten rid of the pre-approval for traveling between countries, which was nice. Some of it, travel is just one of those things. It's generally a large cost for many groups, and therefore, as auditors, we end up looking at it. How well is it documented? It's things like that. I don't think there's any. It's just a large item, and these are some of the larger expenses that we see up there. That's the only reason we put them up there. But the whole listing is in subpart E.
Yep. And some typically unallowable costs, and none of these have changed in the uniform guidance. So
the only one that's probably not up there is the participant cost. Yep. Which is a little bit new, although it's not really new because they kind of threw it out in many of my clients anyway. The advertising, and let me just speak to this for a second because we probably all have a line item that says public relations and advertising, and it's probably recruitment, not advertising, if you look at your financial statements, and I would tell you to probably change it to say recruitment instead of advertising. Advertising being we're advertising what the organization does, and the U.S. government doesn't want to pay for that. So they consider it, but recruitment, hiring staff for positions, that's fine. So, and I think when I start to generally ask people what's in advertising, they're like, oh, we ran newspaper ads. We were looking for this position. And so I would just say, let's probably change the terminology a little bit on your financial statements if you're dealing with the federal government. Bad debt expense, yeah, out. Provisions and contingencies, you know, I have a lot of groups that work in some strange lands, and they might have a provision for unanticipated losses. Best way I can describe it. And, you know, it could be anything, and so you have a provision and you just take it out of the calculation. Donations and contributions generally unallowable because that's up to the discretion of the organization. You're just funding another charity. That does not include grants to other organizations. Those are fine. Entertainment, which I say entertainment, alcoholic beverages. So I work with a lot of French agencies. Yeah. The receipt just usually says dinner and drinks. I mean, we got away from listing the wine. You know, so just be careful. You know, the bottom line is that's never going to be a big number. But
all right.
I hope.
We'll go with that.
Yeah.
We'll go with that, right?
Full disclaimer.
It shouldn't sway the rate. How's that? Fines and penalties are out. Those are interesting. You know, generally you don't see a lot of those. Interest expense. I suppose this could be allowable in certain cases, but generally speaking, it's not. And I would just take it out of the calculation just to make it easy. It's been allowable in some cases, but I mean, you gotta jump through a lot of hoops to get it to be allowable, and it's probably just easier to take it out of the calculation. There are other costs that, you know, and I will tell you that as you go through and you're doing your rate, if you have a large expense that's a one-time, you know, it just could be a one-time thing, and it just distorts it, I would take it out of the calculation and just put write a footnote saying this was a one-time, you know, and it's just distorting the whole thing. And so anything that distorts the rate and is a one-time exception is fine to take out. And I've even had the U.S. government come back to me on a couple occasions saying, are there any one-time exceptions that you would take out? We talked about this a little bit earlier. Fundraising costs are part of the denominator. And lobbying expenditures are considered a program. Now, I would probably tell you that we're switching lines here, but you know, I probably would say the category wouldn't necessarily be lobbying. It might be legislative affairs, which is what I would see more often than not. And within legislative affairs, you have some lobbying. Okay, you need to know the lobbying for your 990 purposes, right? If it's legislative affairs, I'd say that's a program, and it's probably a direct cost anyway, because that's a program of what we're doing, and it would fall under the denominator.
Let's look at, so we have an example. So first, we just have like kind of the calculation for direct cost base, what would be your indirect cost pool, and then we'll walk through kind of what that looks like in numbers. So as Bob had mentioned before, our direct cost base does include both the program expenses and our fundraising line item. Then we would adjust out any of those unallowable expenses, what we've talked about for the grants in excess of the $25,000. And so also important with that, you know, we need to make sure our chart of accounts, our general ledger is set up appropriately to track that as well. That, you know, we're charging the first $25,000 of sub-expenses to one account and then charging the rest to another account. And so we need to make sure we have controls in place to actively track that to be able to factor it in for our indirect rates. Then any one-time reallocations, which we've talked about, and then backing out your equipment and capital expenditures. The indirect cost pool, so we start with that management in general line item, and then again the unallowable costs are backed out. So lobbying expenditures
and if there are any one-time reallocation of costs between indirect and direct.
Yeah, and here's the interesting about the unallowable costs, and this just is agency to agency as to how you, some agencies tell you to take it out of the calculation completely.
Some can move it.
Others say, well, it's unallowable as an indirect, therefore put it as a direct cost.
Yep.
If you can get them to just take it out of the calculation, that's better. Don't put it back in on the direct side. But there's no rhyme or reason. It's just depending on who's approving your rate. Generally, though, the thought process was if you have a recurring unallowable cost, for instance, interest on a mortgage, you bought the building and you're paying interest, it's a recurring cost. That generally would go back over as a direct cost. However, there are groups that just say, take it out. So agency to agency, it will not be consistent. So for some of you who have gone from one group, you've moved jobs from one group to another. Previously, you were funded by Department of Health and Human Services. Now you're funded by AID. You may see them handle this differently.
Okay. Do you want to walk us through the sample rate calculation? So as we mentioned on the page, so we have our total program services, our total fundraising to get to the unmodified direct costs. We're adding back unallowable expenses into the direct space.
Or we're adding some back.
Some, because there's 200 taken down, and we've determined that 50 should be added back to the direct
and let's say 50
space.
was that recurring interest, the other 150 was just one.
Take it out. Yep. Yeah. Then we're taking out our grants and it should say subawards in excess of $25,000 and any equipment and capital expenditures to get us to our allowable base. Then on the indirect side, we have the G&A, less any unallowables, and as we said before, if we have lobbying or one-time items that should be moved to get us to our allowable indirect. So one of the other items that we don't have on here, a lot of in-kind, you would need to remove that. That's a common one. So in-kind donations, which isn't up here.
I mean, you could have in-kind legal services. They could be under management in general. You could have in-kind rent. That could be under both.
Yep.
You could have in-kind supplies, materials, and that would be under the direct. And all the in-kind should come out.
Yep.
This is the indirect calculation is really based upon costs incurred. And if it's in-kind, it's not incurred.
Yep.
I will tell you now, as I look at this, what we really have here is the front page of the report. There's usually in the second page, because they want to see the breakdown of your management and general expenses.
Yes.
So they're going to want to see the breakdown of the $8 million. And whether you refer back to your audit report or whether you have the separate.
Typically, you would have a separate listing of what comprises this $8 million.
Right, and then there's generally footnotes. You'd have footnotes explaining the unallowable expenses. You would have footnotes on the presentation, maybe the equipment. That would all be disclosed in your notes to this rate calculation. This is pretty simple right here. It's a pretty simple graphic. Many organizations are much more complicated. And there's a lot of pushback by a lot of the agencies right now. They're questioning all sorts of things. And one of the most common questions that my clients are getting right now is, how much test work did the auditors do over the indirect expenses? And the answer to that, if I'm sitting where you're sitting, the answer to that is, I don't know. The auditors do what they do. I don't dictate what they do. And so I think it's a question that is inappropriate, and I had a long discussion with the woman who runs one of these branches now, and I explained to her that, we do our test work a certain manner. If I'm doing test work, control test work, and I'm testing the process, I don't care whether it hits indirect or direct as long as I know it's being charged appropriately. Same with timesheets. So it's kind of hard to quantify that for them. So, and I think it's an inappropriate question. I think there are inappropriate questions that they've been asking all over the place. They asked for a trial balance for one of my clients, but that would go under the assumption they know how to read that trial balance and which numbers go in which columns. So sure, have at it. You know, so there's a lot of pushback right now, and part of it has to do with the change in personnel. You've got new people who are assuming positions of authority that haven't been there before, and they need to understand the process. And because I finally said, well, you know, if I'm the auditor, why am I preparing this and sending it in to you anymore when you're not going to rely upon it? I can save myself time and the client time and money. And, you know, so there's been some dialogue back and forth on that.
There have been, the agencies have been asking for an unusual amount of additional information when you're submitting your NICRAs. So in general, that's certainly a theme that we've been seeing. And the requests are all, who knows what they're going to ask for. Oftentimes they really don't, it doesn't make sense what they're asking for. But regardless, you know.
I mean, they're your funding source. However, this group is not the one that dictates, you know, whether you get the grant or not get the grant. Your contract officer overrides everything financial within the, you know, within these agencies. So be on good terms with your contract officers. I mean, that's, you know, because even if you have unallowable costs, the contract officer can say, no, you know what, I'm going to fund it, it's okay. And so you deal with your contract officer. You have to answer these questions to the best of your ability and within reason. But again, just recently or within the last year, I've had them ask for personnel evaluations for every employee. Now, what does that have to do with calculating an indirect rate? I mean, you know, just, you know, obviously the answer is no. It's a legal issue. You know, so there are questions that are being asked and raised that don't necessarily make sense. And you have to recognize that while these people have been there a while, they're not sitting in your positions, and you have more experience. And you just have to, you know.
Educate.
Yeah, educate is a good word. But it's easy to get frustrated, and I understand that. But at the end of the day, you'll probably be the one that comes out with the right rate. And at times, they may say, well, we're going to disallow this. And, you know, if they change the rate to 0.01%, you may just say, you know what, I don't care, go. Because it's not worth the time and effort to keep fighting. So there, you know, there are business decisions in here. And again, that's why it's negotiated. You know, in my heart of hearts, I would say pick a number between 15 and 20%. Give everybody that number. They did it at 10. For those that don't have a rate, why don't they just come up with a number and say, here's what we'll give you, live with it.
So anyone, Sherry, did you have?
Well, I was just thinking, so last week I was at the Insight NGO conference, and the actual people from USAID who approve these rates were there and had a session for us, and they claim that they've talked to auditors and asked them what they do to evaluate the indirect rate, and that in their research of this, they determined that a lot, not maybe all, but a lot don't do anything, but it shows up in the audit report as a schedule. It looks like something was done to it, but not necessarily done to it. So they don't have faith in what's in there, and so because of that, they decide to take it on themselves to delve into it and ask these deeper questions and that kind of stuff. So I guess I'd say, is there anything that the CPA firms could do for us, like if you are looking at indirect and doing something more and choosing some selections from there, so like could somehow you...
I think the CPA firm can help answer their questions. Because I know this is the exact, and your answer that you just gave to me is similar to what I received via email. but we had a long conversation, and I said, you have to understand what we do. And in no cases did she mentioned that she was not going to dictate what the auditors do at all. And so I have that in writing. She says, what you do is what you do. I think that, when, as an auditor going through your financial statements, you prepare the financial statements, we give an opinion on them. We start with that. But, as I said, we're going to look at the numbers and where they fall and how they get to where they get. And then, we're going to sit there and discuss this. So I think every audit firm probably does that. They all have their review process. They all look at it. I'm not sure, if I picked a random transaction, how do I know where it goes, or where it's coded? What I'm more interested in is, are your controls working? Because if your controls are working, then I'm going to rely on your internal controls that things are stated properly. Now, I may look at that list of, management and general costs when I'm looking at the indirect rate, and I'm sure every firm does, and pick out items that, may up and down. But I don't know that there's more work that should be done, but I think the audit firms can help with the response.
Right.
Okay?
And they did say that if we're able, on an individual basis, if we're able to somehow prove either from the auditors directly talking to them or us supplying them with the information that the auditors did actually test it and look at it, that they would ask less questions.
Right. But and what I came down with was, I don't have a problem with them saying, well, you have miscellaneous expense of $100,000. Tell me what's in there. I don't have a problem with them picking a cost and saying, what's the detail within here, to make sure that there's nothing strange in there. We both agreed that that was okay. But, dictating that we have to do more work or they're not going to rely on our work was where that's where I had the issue. And that's when I sent, so we've gone back and forth. And I think it's just them starting to understand the audit process, because what we do doesn't line up with what they think we should do. I mean, we're not there to randomly pick items out of your indirect costs to make sure they're right. If I can rely on your internal controls, I can rely on your internal controls. And that's where they're having trouble. And again, with payroll, I'm not sure I wouldn't be lucky enough to pick the ones that make up the indirect part, Yeah. So I think part of this is going to be educating them on the audit process. And I think they'll ask less questions. And I think my email, and this is strictly the agency you deal with, but my email, I think, helped them understand a little bit of the process over control test work and how we evaluate things. So I think part of this is just going to be dealing with your audit firms also.
Yeah, they should be able to help explain any questions that come up.
How much would I know that they do reviews of audit firms, like through the peer review program.
Yeah.
So how much could the CPA firms as a group push back and say, if you really got issues with firms, why don't you deal with that through the AICPA and the peer review process?
Yeah.
I'm just
and
thinking
some of these
different
agencies
ways.
have approved audit firms, like that are on a list of approved firms, so, I mean, that's one concept. That would be a hard process to change and probably a slow moving. So, in an ideal world, yeah, there would be other checks and balances out there, ensuring that, organizations or who you select as the auditor are doing what they're supposed to. And I guess maybe that just kind of speaks to, organizations and you all, as you're going through your rebid process and asking questions of your potential firms and understanding what experience they do have with these uniform guidance audits. And, maybe it's not a function of, well, we're going to pick the cheapest CPA firm, but we're going to pick the CPA firm that we know knows UG audits and are going to do the proper procedures and be able to explain all the processes that are done so that if questions do arise by the federal agencies, you're not receiving a substandard audit, and that, you know, so maybe I push back and say that's on the organization's part as part of selecting their audit firm.
Yeah, absolutely, and as much as I would like to say they rely on the peer review and this and that, but I don't think I win this argument. I just don't think I can win this argument. I mean, you know, another one I just dealt with recently, they wanted the indirect salary breakdown by individual, the percentage. And I'm like, you mean to tell me that, and fortunately the CFO was really good and went back and calculated, you know, but think about how many employees some of you have, and they wanted the indirect breakdown by employee. And I'm like, it absolutely makes no sense to me. Right, but I mean, somebody's got to do it, though.
I understand, but that's not CFO work.
No, but I mean, right. Well, okay, fine. The CFO is the one that gave me the answer. How's that? But I mean, I just, you know, so I think a lot of this is just time of educating them on the process. And I also believe that once they get to know your organization, things go smoother. Now the problem is that when there's turnover, you get a new person looking at your rate. You know, and every agency is a little bit different as to how they divvy up the work. You know, and if you change the name of your organization, you're going to get a new person because they generally divvy it up by the alphabet. A through E goes to this person. So if you go from having a name that starts with N to one that starts with A, you go from national to American, you get a whole new person. And you just, I mean, it's, you know, so, you know, you're going to catch more with honey than with, you know, so it helps to be nice, but there are times when you should also push back and say, it's, you know, this is kind of an unreasonable request.
All right, so just pausing for a second. So our three CPE words were indirect, cost, and rate. I think I missed the cost in there somewhere. So anyway, you know. So just wanted to reiterate that. And then we've actually had a lot of questions online, and we're obviously not going to be able to get to them. But well, yeah, I can run through a few. But, you know, for those of you that need to sign off and have submitted questions, we absolutely will get back to you with answers over the next week or two. And as Bob mentioned before, you know, we're available for questions all year. Usually it's a relatively easy answer for us, so we're not looking to, you know, nickel and dime you over fees or even bill you, so just pick up the phone, give us a call, you know, we can give you the answer. All right, so do you want me to?
Yeah, let's see what, you know, go ahead. We gotta, you know, people can fill out, people can fill out evaluations, do whatever you'd like. We'll answer some of these questions.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Will you send the questions and answers to everyone? Or
yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea. Yeah, thanks for that. We absolutely will send out the questions and answers. The ones that are coming that we haven't gotten to, we'll put together a document and address some of these and distribute it. So I love this question. If our actual rate exceeds our provisional rate, are the U.S. government funders required to pay the higher actual rate? If you have a provisional rate, yes. Provisional is just provisional. If your actual comes in higher, you true up at the end of the year. And
but
if you have funds available,
right?
Exactly.
There's a budget.
There's a budget. If you have funds available, obligated. And so this next question says, you know, if the grants are closed out, what if the federal agency has closed the grants and no adjustments are admissible? What should we do? And that's kind of like, well, if there's no funds available, you closed out at a provisional rate and didn't adjust to your final, that's it.
you know.
Don't sign anything.
Yeah, and so that goes back to Bob, keep the grants open until you've gotten you can't do anything else. Go ahead.
Well, and would that be an audit issue then if an auditor came
Absolutely,
in
and that's the next question. Would that be a finding in your UG report? So receiving a final rate after year end that's closed out, the audit report's issued and a provisional rate was used. Possibly, I've had an organization $600,000 later, they realized that they needed an adjustment that wasn't booked. Yes, you know, that's a finding. That's where it becomes an issue. Is it material? Is it systemic? Is it happening over and over? Do you have the controls in place, or was it just something that was small, that was missed on an old small grant that, you know, we couldn't get the closeout? So what does it look like in the grand scheme of things would be an ultimate determination if that comes up as far as a systemic, recurring, reportable finding.
I would like to think that most of these differences in indirect rates are no more than 1 to 2%. I mean, you know, the differences shouldn't be large enough for it to be a material number. I mean, in that case,
yeah, that one was a problem.
but generally speaking, you know, if the rate is 17, they adjust it to 16.8. I mean, that 0.2% isn't going to matter one way or the other.
Yeah. And just to let everybody know, we are going to be having a webinar in September on cost allocations and maybe
indirect rates.
Indirect rates, and maybe we can pick up some of the questions that did not get addressed here in that webinar. So that maybe you can join us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thanks everyone, and thanks to our online attendees. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. If you have a fixed rate that was given to you 1 billion years ago, let's just say 5. Do you have to do an incurred cost submission for that?
No, it's fixed, it's fixed.
That's what I thought. Okay. I had a lot of people telling me. And I was like, that's crazy.
If you have a fixed rate, you're golden.
I've never
Nothing to
well, you're golden.
Well, assuming it's good enough.
There you go. There you go. So if you wanted to go to a nicer place, you'd have to go through
the whole process.
And